We're going to look at Esther today, and the first thing that comes to most people's minds when you hear about Esther, it's one of the only books that doesn't mention God. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. And there's a lot of controversy over it. There has been in the past, and there's still some to this day. And we're not going to get into controversy. What we're going to get into is God's Word. It's been left here for a reason. There's a lesson that comes from it, and we're going to look at some of those things. We're going to try and get through the first 2 chapters today, and then finish off over the course of the next Wednesday, or maybe 2 Wednesdays, or maybe 3, depending on how it goes. So, I want to start off, essentially, to get that out of the way. God is here. These are the 2 things that the book of Esther shows us. Number 1 is that God's sovereignty. God is always there, whether He's mentioned or not. God's hand is all over everything, especially in the lives of believers. Whether He's at the very forefront of everything that we do, or whether He's sitting behind the scenes waiting for us to make the decisions that we need to make to show what He can do for us. The second thing, the biggest takeaway from this at the end, is the festival or the celebration of Purim. And this is the last of the historical books of the Bible. And this is one of the books outside of the Mosaic Law that this is one of 2 festivals that take place outside of the Mosaic Law. Festival of Purim and Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah. Outside of those things, we're talking about an orphan child who's being brought up by her cousin during the dispersion in the Persian Empire under the reign of a Persian king. Let's start with verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus, who reigned over the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, or Susa, also called Susa, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Now let's stop there. So I had sent a map to proclaim, and it didn't show up, or it didn't. But the Persian Empire is huge. Obviously, 127 provinces, one of the largest in the ancient times. Now, Ahasuerus had Xerxes. Xerxes is his Greek name. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's easier for me to say Xerxes, so I think I might just go with that. And I did. I practiced Ahasuerus over and over and over again. It just never comes out sounding properly. It doesn't come out sounding good to my ears anyway. So we'll just call him Xerxes. So Xerxes, King Xerxes, has this lavish feast, this lavish celebration over the course of 6 months, showing off all that he has, all that he has accomplished, the things that he has gathered, the territories that he has conquered, and he holds this celebration for all the amen on his team. Where is it that we find anywhere in our society where we can find a parallel to that? we find it all over the place. We find it in the people who sit in our seats of government. We find it in the people who provide entertainment. We find it in the people that provide music for us. The lavishness and the riches that these people, it sounds, it's not meant to be negative, that these people have acquired. What they like to do is show off. What they like to do is bring forth the things that they have accomplished. Look what I have done. Look what I am capable of doing, and look what it is that I have done outside of God. Not to say that every single person who has accomplished something has left God out of the equation, but this is a prime example. Here, King Xerxes, of what you take forward and leave God or your other gods. You take your other gods with you and leave the true God out of the equation. And we're going to find out as we read through this. So, King Xerxes is full of pride. He's excess. There's 6 months worth of feasting and festival and celebration. That's a constant. Imagine what it takes to pull something like this off. And of course, it's not just him. All of the people in the provinces, they're going to get their 1 week, as we'll find out later. So, in verse 5, and when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in the capital, Susa, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So for 6 months, all of the princes and the governors and the senators and the congressmen all gathered together, and they got their celebration and they got their due. But the commoners, you got your week. You got 1 week. So come and enjoy what it is that we have done for you. Look what we have done. Now here's verse 6. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white, and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from one another, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. So, what's being described here, you weren't just sitting in regular chairs. You weren't just sitting on the floor. You weren't sitting in a folding chair. You weren't hanging out at the picnic table. You were sitting on couches, right? Which were of gold and silver. The flooring was a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, white, and black marble. So the lavishness and the excess and all of the things that have come, and again, I'm not a historian, so I don't know if these were the spoils of war. I'm sure that that was a big part of it. But if you look at the region, um, if you look at the region, which was his empire, all of these things were readily available. All of these things were at his beck and call. Now, he's accomplished quite a bit. He has made himself an empire to be proud of. And he's showing off. And I think that Xerxes is doing this because there's something missing inside this man. He's pursuing false gods. He's pursuing riches. He's pursuing the things that are of the material and not of the things of God. You know, he knows about the things of God. There's Jewish settlements throughout all of Persia. The previous history has told us of God and his people and what God has done for him and his people. And yet, he lacks the forbearance and the knowledge to move forward and possibly seek him out. Let's continue. Verse 7. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from one another, with royal wine in abundance. So he's letting his men know, you guys are special. You're not going to drink out of the same cup. Everybody gets a different cup. So those cups had to be produced. Those cups had to be handed out. Those cups had to be, it was like your parting gift. It's like, hey, it's like going to a conference, right? You get the t-shirt, Pastors Conference 2022. I got a t-shirt. This was like, King Xerxes thing. It's like, hey, take that golden cup and go on home. You did such a good job. Anyway, God's word is not funny. It's trying to tie into things that we have now. So verse 8, in accordance with the law, drinking was not compulsory, but the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. So in reading the commentaries on this, there were certain societies that you sat around the table, and when the goblet came around, or when the pitcher came around, you continued to drink until you passed out. And if you felt like you could drink no more than you got up from the table, you lost your place at the table. Kind of like musical chairs for alcohol. Right? So, Xerxes, for all of his foolishness, the Persian Empire was also known to be modest in their decorum, except for the lavishness of their feasts. Modest in their decorum, and they were, I had the word, and I can't find it now. Anyway, you don't want to get drunk, so you stop when you get your fill. Because if you do get drunk, then it's on you and nobody else. And it makes no sense at all. Because it was in the notes, and the notes are gone. And that's okay. So, because that was important. It was important because for all the Xerxes and his short temper and some of the witless things that this man did, there were some decorum that went along with how he presented himself in front of other people. So here, verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, so let me back up for that. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Again, going back to historians and commentaries, the women were celebrating in separate quarters from the men. So there was not a mixing and a mingling because of the alcohol consumption, and that would lead to possibly some misdeeds. Verse 10, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, meaning he was drunk, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and I know this is not carcass, but carcass. Yeah, carcass. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So he's drunk. During this time, the men in their provinces bragged about who was the fairest in the land. Xerxes, being drunk, wanting to make a point that he had the fairest in the land, called for his wife to come forward. Breaking the rules of etiquette and modesty to have his wife come forward in front of this group of drunken men and show herself off. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, his attorneys, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence, and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? So the question is not what can I do or what should I do, but what does the law say I'm allowed to do? So even though he's in a drunken state of mind, and he's just been refused an audience by his wife, he still has sense enough to ask, what is legal for me to do? Verse 16, and Memucan answers before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces, 127 of them, of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of this behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. So essentially, Memucan, one of the king's lawyers and one of his noblemen, one of his first men, says to him, not only will this cause strife within your own household and strife within the capital. But once it spreads, it'll spread like wildfire, and women will just start thumbing their nose at their husband. Verse 19. If it pleases the king, which he knew it would please the king, that's their job. Their job is to please the king. Their job is to build him up, tell him what he wants to hear, and move forward. They don't want to tell him what he should do. They don't want to tell him if he's wrong. They don't want to tell him that this is a decision that probably shouldn't have been made in the middle of your drunkenness. But it's too late for that. He's already drunk and he's already made the decision. So now what do we do? Here we go. If it pleases the king, verse 19, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. Does that sound familiar? Any of that at all? Verse 21, and the reply pleased the king. Of course it did. And the princes and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in his own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. I don't know, because I wasn't there, but I'm pretty sure that went over really well with the king after deciding, or after understanding that what he did was probably just outright wrong. And so he has no choice, according to the law. The law says if the king decrees, or if the king commands, and you disobey, you've broken the law. The deeper you get into commentaries, there's two judgments on why Vashti refused. Number one is she refused because of her own personal modesty. And that she wanted to hold the modesty that the women of the times were to hold on to, which was you kept yourself covered. You didn't uncover yourselves except for in front of your husband, and you didn't mingle. That's why they had a separate celebration. The second one is she was just being mean. She was just being non-submissive. She was just being an independent woman. Take what those from what you will. I believe more than likely that she did it because she wanted to hold to the modesty and the decorum of the times and not put herself in a position or put the king in a position to be embarrassed. He was embarrassed anyway. If she had gone, and if something had taken place because she followed the law and she followed the king's command, none of that shame would have fallen on her. However, why put yourself in a position to have to fight off that charge? So, now remember, this was in the third year of his reign. The third year. Chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Susan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch." Is anybody unfamiliar with what a eunuch is? I don't mean that in any, I'm just, so, let me finish. The king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Verse 4, let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. And what they don't tell us here is that Xerxes had just come back from a bitter, unsuccessful attempt to conquer the Grecian Empire. So some time has passed. They're saying 4 years. 4 years has passed from the time that he kicked Vashti out, so to speak, and this time now. So there's 4 years have gone by. He's gone out, he's tried to conquer the Grecian world. It was unsuccessful. Greece was doing well at the time. Athens was a thriving metropolis. They were in the midst of the 79th Olympic Games in Greece. And Xerxes couldn't conquer him. And so he comes back, and his men saying that after the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, so after his defeat in Greece, he comes back and he remembers, oh, I used to have a wife, a queen. Actually, he had many wives, but he only had one queen. Then the king's servants, of course, seeing that he was in such a foul mood, what can we do to make the king happy? Let's round up a bunch of virgins and bring him in and get him a new queen. What does Xerxes do? He's still got that hole. That hole is still there. It hasn't been filled. There's nothing. This empire, he's conquered it. He's got rule over 127 provinces. He's got riches at his command. He's got 400 wives and an ex-queen. He can do whatever he wants, but he's still not satisfied. There's something missing within him. And so he goes out and tries to conquer another land, and he fails. There's a story, I'm going to get off just a little rabbit trail real quick. So there was a point where I can't remember which river or which strait, but he had, Xerxes had his engineers essentially build a bridge, trying to get them from one side to the other, and a storm rose in the ocean. That's what happens in oceans. Storms come along, destroyed his bridge, and he executed his engineers because the bridge failed under the storm, but then he also had the waves whipped and chained. So this is the kind of thinking of the kind of man that we have, that we're dealing with here. He's got everything that he needs materialistically. He's got everything that he needs to satisfy his carnal lusts. But that place inside of him is still vacant. And he's trying to continue, just like an addict or an alcoholic, he's trying to fill it with anything but God. Anything but the thing that will hold you grounded and filled. And some of you might be saying, what does this have to do with? And we're getting there, I promise. Verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured, and with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. This is the introduction. It doesn't say there was just a certain man named Mordecai who happened to be a Jew. There was a Jew, and his name was Mordecai. This shows us that God is there. God's name is not mentioned, but he was a Jew first before they gave his first name. So he was probably, from what we can tell, he was attending temple. He was learning his law and his history. He was in the synagogue when he was supposed to, and he was doing the things that he was supposed to do as a Jew, which was following God, reading his history. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now, I don't know about other cultures during this time, but we know from our reading in Exodus and Leviticus and that this was something that happened. When one of your tribe, when the parents were lost, you took that child and raised them as your own. And again, I don't know about other cultures, but I know that for the Israelites, for the Jewish community, this is the thing that was done. Verse 8. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many, many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of the head eunuch Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace in the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women, the keeper of the virgins. Now, here is an orphaned Jew, exiled and living in a country that doesn't recognize their culture. They accept the fact that they're there because they're useful. They're things that they can be used for. So let's put up with them, essentially. And we'll learn more later on when we get to chapter 3, because there's an underlying anti-Semitism throughout the culture of the Persians. Verse 9, and this is where God's hand comes in. And if you don't, this is God's hand. Now the young woman pleased him, meaning Haggai, the head eunuch, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations. Now, she couldn't have pleased him in the way that culture says that people get pleased. Because he was a eunuch. So, God's hand. This is the chief guy. This is the guy that makes all the decisions. Who goes first? Who is not going until the very last? Who shouldn't even go at all? Whatever we can do to sabotage that person so that she doesn't make it to where she needs to go. She obtained his favor. Out of 400, they're saying that there were 400. The estimate is that there were 400 virgins there at this time. 400. So he readily gave her, verse 9, so he readily gave her beauty preparations to her, besides what she was allowed, or the verse is, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women. That is God's hand all over it. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Mordecai was her guardian, her stepfather, her substitute father. And she was following one of those 10 something, what are they? 10 what? 10 commandments, yeah. Honor thy father and thy mother. Mordecai says, do not reveal, and she does not reveal. Now, again, when you get into your commentary reading, some will say, why would we accept a book that first and foremost doesn't mention God? And then the second thing is ashamed of their Jewishness or their place as Israelites. Why do we accept that as a canon within our 66 books of Scripture? Because as we'll see throughout the reading of this whole book, God's hand is all over it. He is behind the scenes moving the pieces like a chess game. He's having a chess game with the devil. And the devil puts something in place and God says no. And it's a really beautiful thing when you come to the end of it. Now, verse 10, and again, we'll get to this more in depth in chapter 3 with the issue with Mordecai and Haman. So, the reason there's the reason that a lot of commentators are saying that there's an overall tone of anti-Semitism within this Persian Empire is because of a 550-year-old event that took place. Haman was an Agagite, or Agagite. I don't know how to pronounce it, and I don't like using the little thing on the Agagite. Anyway. And this goes all the way back to God's decree to wipe out the Amalekites, and it was not done. And Agag was I want to save all I want to save all that for chapter 3. I apologize. Anyway, big issue 550 years ago that's still being thought about and fought on today, or during this time. Verse 11. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for women, for thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Now, so, verse 12, 12 months, this in I believe it was Guzik, Pastor Guzik, had said that the 12-month period was possibly, 12-month preparation period was, as outside of ritual, was also for the possibility of a pregnancy check. essentially to see if this woman was bearing a child before she slept with the king so that she couldn't claim that the child was the king. Right? The other one, as Matthew Poole, great commentator, said, we have to remember that these were desert peoples. I don't know if anybody ever live in the desert here? Right? Yeah, quite a few of us. And without the modern conveniences that we have today, like showers and running water and things like that. The preparation, because they stunk, to remove the stink of everyday life. In verse 11 gives us kind of a fatherly bit look into how Mordecai cared for Esther. He paced in front of the court of the women's quarters every day to learn of her welfare and what was happening to her. He treated her just like he was his own, just like she was his own. Care of a father, replacement, care of a father figure. Just the love that is shown there is just tremendous. Wonderful stuff. Verse 12. Perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. 13. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from her quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Sheshgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. 400 women, one will be chosen queen. The rule at the time was that if you slept with the king, you had to be married to the king. So you could be his wife, you could be his concubine, but only one was going to be queen. You could belong to no other after that. So as the men of the provinces are rounding up these women, these virgins, and bringing them in and say, you have the opportunity to spin this wheel and become the queen. And 399 concubines sat in wait for him to call her name. This is certainly not God's plan. But God is going to use the folly of men and their plans for the greater good. God is going to use this nonsense to promote and to care for his people. Verse 15, now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, here's God again. She requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. She took nothing extra. She took no extra makeup. She took no extra earrings. She took no extra covering. She took no extra perfume. Nothing except what was given to all women. The same standard beauty package, right? She didn't get an extra, lotion. Nothing extra from Bed Bath & Beyond. And she obtained the favor in the sight of all who saw her. Because she followed after God and his commands. Honor your mother and your father. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Do not kill, do not rob, do not cheat, do not steal. She was doing as Mordecai brought her up. She was doing as her elders and her betters had told her. And I don't mean betters in the sense that in judgment. I just mean that there's a maturity that came with his learning that she was able to pull into her own life. She was able to use that. We'll see all this later. Verse 16, so Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the 7th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. 10th month, December, January in our calendar. So here's where the verification of the 4 years has passed between removing Vashti and bringing in a new queen. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown or headdress upon her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. An orphaned Jew who's nothing to anybody, whose parent, replacement, guardian, substitute, stepfather, and she becomes queen. She becomes queen because God has a plan, because God knows the hearts of those who wish to do his people harm. God knows all of our hearts. And how is it that he's going to use that for his good and for his glory? Verse 19, when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the commands of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Again, she's close to God through her relationship with Mordecai. She's doing as she's commanded by the head of her household. She's the queen, but she still has not revealed her Jewishness. And Mordecai, as you read the commentaries, they will say if he was this close to the king's gate, he was quite a man himself. He had a position, some sort of high position within the court, within the king's court. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So a little kind of a gruesome side note here. They weren't necessarily hanged on gallows. The historians are saying that essentially they were speared. So, and I don't know why I have to share this, but this has to be we have to remember who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the godless. So you grab a man, his legs on either side, impale him. It would come through the neck in your back. So that's what the historians are saying means hanged at the gallows. You weren't actually hung like we see in the old westerns. This was like a sort of crucifixion. And you didn't die immediately. And so this was for all the people to see. This is what happens when you run up against a mean and evil and vicious king who has, like all of us, we have some good parts to us, but there's some dark and deep spots within us. But if we run towards the light, if we move towards the light, if we put ourselves in the path of light instead of the path of darkness, we won't have to visit those places. We won't have to put ourselves in a position to be impaled or hung or put on the gallows. They also say the reason these men were so furious was because of what had happened to Vashti. Now this is a 4-year grudge these men are holding. If that's the case, I don't know. I don't know if the historians ever talked to these two guys before they died. But if the assumption is that they were furious because of Vashti, that's a long time to hold a grudge. Sounds like a whole bunch of alcoholics. To be quite honest with you, we know how to hold a grudge. The point is, when it seems as though God is not there, it's probably when he is most prevalent in our lives. Long before the call, in my early Christendom, my early walk, I never paid attention to God until things got bad. I didn't cry out to God and say, "Thank you, Father, for all the wonderful things that you've done for me today. Lord, how did I get here? How is this? Lord, help me." But he was always there. We will feel his presence the more we turn to him in the good times and praise him and worship him and give him all honor and duty and glory that he deserves. Now, what does that have to do with the first 2 chapters of Esther? The first 2 chapters of Esther, they were going along with their life. It doesn't say that they sang praises to him and worshiped him. But his hand is there. His hand, a young, virginal Jewish exile in a place that has a great deal of anti-Semitism within it, is named queen of an empire that is one of the biggest in history, was one of the biggest in history. How does that happen? Not just because of her beauty, but because of God's hand. She may not have felt his presence. She may have wondered at whatever age it was that she lost her parents, why have you forsaken me? Why is it, where is God in all of this? I have to be under the care of my cousin. But God says, I have a plan. You just don't know what it is. God says, be patient. And during that time, be a good and faithful servant. That's what Mordecai was. And she learned from Mordecai what it means to be good and faithful and true. So Wednesday night we'll get into the rest of it. We'll make an attempt to get through as much as we can. You know, when you learn that God doesn't have to be a neon sign in front of everything that we do, because God is here, and if he's not here, you're not going to find it out there. God has to be in a special place within you. Thank you. Has to be in a special place within you for you to reach out and communicate with him. And he is. He's all around us.